Welcome to today's webinar entitled The Transition to All-IP and Next-Gen 911, Why Getting It Right Matters. My name is Zach Kunkel, and I'm the Director of Solution Marketing and Go-to-Market Strategy here at Bandwidth, and I'm going to be today's host of our webinar. Joining me is Greg Rogers, our Head of Global Public Policy, and Robin Urkala, our Emergency Services Savant or Solution Engineer. But before we begin, gonna share just a few housekeeping reminders. So one, you've probably been on a webinar before, but all lines are muted to prevent any background noise. Two, we're gonna have a lot of time at the end for Q&A. You can enter all of your questions into the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. I'm pointing to the right in real life. Maybe that's the left, but you understand. And we're gonna reserve time at the end for that Q&A. And then at the end, we will also be recording today's webcast. We're going to send the recording over in the next couple of days, so make sure that you're on the lookout for that. So with that, I'm going to toss it over to you, Robin. Hope you like the Emergency Services Savant title that I just gave you.
Yeah, thank you. I might have to have you talk to my wife a little bit so you can promote my savantness. But anyway, yes, let's dig in. All right, so Greg, excited to do this with you today. This is going to be a lot of fun, I think. So agenda-wise, we really have three main topics we want to cover. Kind of next gen in general, what's going on with next gen these days, all the regulatory background and what's going on there, considerations of the tech transition into next gen 911, and how to prepare for next gen 911. So like Zach had mentioned, Greg is going to bring the legal and regulatory aspect to this. I'm going to bring the technical and savant aspect to this, and then we're gonna go from there. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about next gen 911 and kind of what's going on in the marketplace, in the marketplace today. And so, Greg, I'll just preface this by saying, we've been working as an industry, we've been working on next gen 911 for over 10 years. Some people would say 15 years, trying to get, people get these systems migrated over to an all IP network and all the goodness that comes along with that. Do you want to lay any groundwork for the regulatory aspect of next gen 911 here as we kick things off?
Yeah, I think that's a good introduction and it really begs the question of what's new now. If it's been going on for 10 years, why should we be particularly interested in what's happening now? And I think what's happening now is you're starting to see very real migrations, transitions occurring, with some amount of speed across the industry. But that also means that as more and more next gen networks come online or are attempting to come online, you're seeing a lot of issues from one deployment to the next. And I think that's really what we're here to kind of highlight a little bit and try to coordinate with people to smooth out some of the rough and difficult challenges that we're encountering to try to ensure that 911 services remain as robust and even become enhanced in a next gen 911 network as the migration occurs.
Yeah, exactly. We're all here. I think everybody in the public safety business, 911, 112, emergency calling, whatever you want to call it, I think we all have a passion to save lives and protect property and help, the first responders get on scene as quick as possible and all that stuff. Now, so I'm going to use the word chaos here. Not only is emergencies chaotic, but also as we've progressed into NG911, there's been some chaos. And so I think that's one of the key things we're talking about here today is how can, we're as Greg mentioned a few moments ago, we're looking for partners in how to make order out of this chaos. Anything there, Greg?
Yeah, I think the thing here, it's always a little bit scary to talk about chaotic scenarios when we're talking about 911 calling. I think you're right to point out that emergency calling is oftentimes chaotic unto itself, which is why you want, the voice calling capabilities that are delivering those calls to be reliable, resilient, and the challenges that the industry is facing as it migrates off of the traditional TDM, PSTN, selective router, call delivery architectures into a next-gen ESINet architecture, is there are real risks of disruptions. And there are new players, there are different standards that everyone's trying to adjust to. The FCC has, in order to spur deployment, allowed people and mandated that service providers be prepared to connect within 6 months' time of ESINets declaring their readiness. And then two, to move into a full I3 next-gen scenario when they're ready as well. So, it's been dragging on for a long time, but now is happening really fast. And it's happening at a time where there's still a lot of unanswered questions out there.
Yeah. And speaking of those unanswered questions, there's a lot around, everything from what are we doing with these legacy E911 networks to next gen and all the stuff in between. And so we've got some words on the screen here, everything from copper retirement to next gen. And these things are generally in the same vein, but especially from a regulatory perspective, they have different meanings and impact on what's going on.
Yeah, and I think in the broader context of what's going on across the industry, these terms have been terms that probably have gone on even longer than 10 years. As you say, that the efforts to deploy next gen, call it a decade plus, these questions have been out there from the advent, really, of the internet. If you think about the advent of voice over IP calling, people predicted that everything would move to an all-IP environment much faster than has happened. Yet, what we're experiencing right now is it has gone on, in a very slow manner, the transition occurring very sort of in spotty ways. But now it's happening everywhere, all of a sudden, and without much guidance, without much oversight. And so as copper retirement happens, as services get turned down without a great deal of notice, there may have been some sort of recommendation or a notice that was given 3 years ago that they intended to turn down their copper, but all of a sudden it just happened today. Like, that's the kind of stuff that's occurring in the ecosystem that has very real effects on the capability to deliver 911 calls. And so that's what we're here to kind of highlight for people as this transition is unfolding.
Yeah, exactly. I have a lot of conversations with our customers and prospects around 911 in general. And a lot of times there's some education that's involved. And I'll talk to them about, the FCC has regulations for good old fashioned wireline, which is, the copper retirement. I mean, it really is being retired. And I got a story on that in a second. And then you've got the voice over IP stuff, which is actually growing. And then you got the wireless rules. And so each of those three modalities, if you will, voice over IP, wireless or mobility, and good old fashioned wireline, they have different rules from the FCC that pertain to that. And that's what we're all trying to adapt to as we move those modalities into next gen 911 and make things work. Because 911 was based on TDM, old analog technology that's 50 years old, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so we're getting there. The story I like to tell is I just built a house. We wanted to put in a phone system so we could call 911 when there's no power, and trying to actually get a copper wireline phone hooked into our house has been problematic to the point where it doesn't work. So we're seeing, like you said, voice over IP, mobility, these are the growing things right now. And voice over IP in particular, I mean, everybody's using Teams or Zoom or WebEx or RingCentral or whatever, right? they're using all these different, UCAS systems and so forth. And that's where, that's where it spills over into, all right, these legacy E911 environments and moving them to next gen. There's just a lot of challenges here, so to speak. Let's move on here to, so you alluded a few moments ago, Greg, to the new requirements, right? We've got these new, a new regulation coming from the FCC that was just approved a few weeks ago, and they're already looking at tweaking it with a further notice for proposed rulemaking. There's all kinds of fun stuff going on here. So as you said, the bottom line is it's to spur on, right? The FCC can't regulate PSAPs, but they can regulate carriers like bandwidth and all our customers. And so they're saying, hey, carriers, you need to respond effectively to requests for next gen service, and they're trying to do what they can. The FCC is trying to do what they can to regulatory wise push us down the road, but there's complications with that.
I'll jump in there because I think that's a key term. There are complications, right? I think one of the things that perhaps hasn't been appreciated to its fullest degree is how complicated this all is. That it on its face sounds like, we've been at this for over a decade and everyone should be ready and let's go do it, without an appreciation that we're talking about over 5,000 PSAPs across the country, without really appreciating, exactly where each and every one of those PSAPs stands with respect to its capabilities to change its interconnection architecture, its IP enablement for enabling call delivery and call processing in an IP format, without considering that there are brand new providers bidding to become ESINet providers who have never been a selective router provider, without contemplating that the ILECs are turning down access to selective routers and trying to deregulate all of their ILEC nests. They don't want to be ILECs anymore, without much notice. Without contemplating that TDM transport costs are skyrocketing that have been deregulated within the last couple of years. And then you multiply all of that across every single PSAP in the country, and then you're supposed to be ready to do it, we, bandwidth, and its customers within 6 months of a PSAP declaring its readiness to be interconnected with in an IP format. Again, this has been something that bandwidth is a proponent of, has been requesting to move faster on. But what we're saying here is that it needs to be done in an orderly fashion, in a way that is manageable for everybody, for it to succeed. And that's really what we're kind of currently wrestling with and trying to accomplish with the rest of the industry players.
Yeah, make some order out of that chaos, because it is complex and chaotic when you've got this push to move to IP, but at this, and turn down these legacy circuits and so forth. But at the same time, there's going to be a transitionary period where we still have to maintain those legacy environments for a little bit. I mean, there's a transition that has to go on, right?
And everybody has to be coordinated in doing it. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is the key thing is like, it takes everyone, it takes a village, and you all have to do it on the same timeline. And what we're finding is there are wide ranges of capabilities, of sophistication, of preparedness out there among all the different service providers that go into making a successful next gen deployment. That's what, is proving to be extremely challenging.
Yeah, and like you said, Greg, it's on so many different facets from so many different perspectives, right? You've got just the initial phase one, delivering calls over an IP infrastructure, doing that, right? Bandwidth has actually been doing that in some states, in some regions for several years now. And so it's sometimes it's easy to do that, but sometimes it's not, right? So there's that aspect. But then as we get into phase two, that becomes, like you said, great. Oh my gosh, you get all kinds of different standards out there, and and people are interpreting the i3 next gen 911 standard from NENA differently. And the core there is, okay, yeah, let's use something like Pitaflow or something like that, some technology to transmit the location with the call. But there's devils in the details in terms of how to make all that work, and there's a lot to think through there.
Yeah, I don't know what our next slide is, but I think you've really hit on kind of the key things that demonstrate how wide the range is across the country of where ESINet deployment stands. Some providers and some scenarios have been there for years, and they're starting to get into the weeds of a full i3 set of questions, and how do we do full i3 in a phase 2 environment. But on the other hand, you have PSAPs in rural areas who may have IP enabled themselves with equipment, who are now saying, I'm independent and I want everybody to connect directly to me. And there's literally no way to connect to them directly.
Yeah.
So, again, a very wide range of issues to try to manage across the entire country.
Absolutely. You've got some states that are organized, and some states are organized better than others, but there are some states that are well organized. And what I mean by that is the PSAPs are collaborating, and they have things going on at a state level. But then you got other states that are disorganized, if you will. They rely on local authorities to determine what they're going to do for 911 and even next gen 911. And so it varies from the county to the state level and everywhere in between. It's just kind of nuts. And so because of all that adjustment, we do have that new ruling that we talked about on the previous slide. But then in addition to that, there's this further notice for proposal rulemaking. And I've read this several times, and I'm starting to really get interested. I mean, it's interesting, and it's really going to change some of the definitions and some of the things we're talking about in traditional telecom. I mean, the lines are being blurred. When everything moves to IP, you can't easily separate data from voice anymore. It's all becoming blurred. And so, yeah.
So here, I think
yeah,
the objectives of the FMPRM with regard to enhancing resiliency and reliability are well-intentioned, right?
Yeah.
It makes good sense that you want the next generation of emergency calling network of networks to be as resilient and reliable as possible. I just think the timing's wrong, right? The timing doesn't fit now with all that's going on as it relates to the IP transition. Here, what's happening is really fundamentally they're expanding some of the current rules that exist in the more traditional network architectures as to who's covered by the resiliency reliability rules, and they're really capturing everybody. They're throwing a very broad net out to say, now going forward, we propose that everyone would be considered a covered service provider. And it goes along with the new PSAP outage reporting rules, which say you have very, very aggressive timelines to report outages to all PSAPs. Again, really big and very challenging rules that they are proposing that have not existed until now. And what's happening now is the PSTN to IP transition is proving to be extremely lumpy, I guess I would say. And so you can imagine resiliency and reliability actually being worse at the very time they're telling everyone to make it better. So that is something I think the industry as a whole is trying to articulate and convey to the FCC. And I think there's becoming more of a greater sharing of that awareness and position. Even the PSAPs who thought they wanted, really aggressive notifications. They didn't sort of appreciate how many service providers are out there trying to manage these new rules and how many people might be calling to ensure that they're giving outage notifications. Those are the current, operational challenges that everyone's really wrestling with. And certainly we are, and where they're trying to support customers with this, but we're also looking to partner with people in identifying the challenges and trying to resolve those challenges.
I think if there's one thing the audience can walk away from this webinar with is an understanding that with this FNPRM, the definition of a covered 911 service provider is changing, expanding. People who were not defined as a covered 911 service provider before, once this regulation takes effect, they will be classified as a covered 911 service provider. And I would just encourage people to be aware of this, and because it has significant implications in how you operate your network, how you interact with third parties like bandwidth and others, and so on and so forth. This is a big thing. There's some proposed definitions in here that I think a lot of bandwidth customers are going to be surprised to see. So
I think on that point, Robin, I would just leave people with, there's an open comment period coming where people can, participate in the development of the rules. Like, these are proposed rules at this point, and service providers and the public generally have an opportunity to submit comments for consideration about, where the rules ultimately should land, even including, this is not the appropriate time to try to ramp up regulations on everybody when the deregulation of the rest of the industry is going to affect their ability to comply with these new onerous regulations. So, there's some key public policy considerations for people to be aware of.
All kinds, yeah. And I have to put part of my sales savant hat thing on for a second and say, you mentioned PSAP outage alerts, right? Bandwidth, we've gone through a significant effort to build a solution, and please reach out, to us and if you want to learn more about it, because it's a solution that it can allow you to comply with these regulations. So reach out if you have some interest. All right. So as we move on into the tech transition, anything else, Greg, you want to cover before we kind of shift gears slightly here and talk about the more technical aspect of this and some of the details there?
Yeah, or I think the broader tech transition is what we want to talk about, as opposed to just the subset of next gen transitions, and how those two things relate to each other. And really, I think it's worth just saying that, what used to be the architecture to support 911 calling pretty much always included connectivity through an ILEC to a selective router for routing and delivery of calls to a PSAP. And that was the architecture. And those PSAPs are now moving off of those selective routers and being expected to either declare themselves to be an ESINet or connect to ESINets to be able to receive those calls. And what's happening in the broader tech transition, as you kind of said, as you tried to deploy a wireline copper emergency calling solution for your own home, you can't do it. It doesn't exist. And that may be true here in Colorado in your marketplace, but that isn't true across the country, right?
Right.
And it's happening at different times in different ways from one PSAP to the next. And highlighting that it's really that PSAP emergency calling component to the overall IP transition, copper retirement, that they go together. You can't have one without the other. Voice calling includes the capability to make 911 calls.
Yeah. And like we've said, this transition to next gen is underway. The transition to IP, is supposed to increase the capabilities and the reliability and the resiliency of these networks, right? And the idea here is that I've heard it described many times. It's a network of networks. Before, under selective routers and stuff, it was really one network. It was, it was a TDM, CAMA based, analog network. And now as we move into these IP networks, there's really a network of networks. You've got, it's really a collection of ESI nets, right? And then you've got different services within those ESI nets that make all this call routing and everything work well. And it becomes more complex, but the idea is that when you build it out with redundancy and resiliency in mind, it's super, super beneficial. Case in point, Hurricane Helene in North Carolina, just down the road from our headquarters office in Raleigh, North Carolina, in Asheville, during Hurricane Helene, they were able to leverage some of this technology so that no 911 calls went unanswered. Right? That would have been unheard of years ago in an all analog selective router based network. But with this now, but that's only that's unique to North Carolina at this point, and they've implemented a certain way. So again, I'm excited about what NextGen brings in terms of these IP-based networks having better resiliency, and then also it's going to include additional data, more information. Before 911 was very, very much limited to a call and a location. That was it. Now we can get into SMS text to 911 and additional data and health data and
pictures, video, right?
video.
Yeah.
I mean, how many PSAPs are out there exploring drones? I mean, there's all kinds of good stuff out there.
Yeah, to connect into a robust IP network of networks, right, for the exchange in real time of really feature-rich communications. Again, that's something that Bandwidth is striving to enable and support our cloud-based communications to their fullest extent, with all the feature richness that goes along with it. But there has to be a recognition of a transitionary, an orderly transitionary path to get to that point. That is the end goal. We're very much supportive of it, and we think it does hold a lot of promise. We're here to try to make the transition to it as smooth as possible.
Yeah. And part of that transition, as we've kind of alluded to already, is POTS is phasing out. The good old POTS and not the PSTN, but POTS is phasing out. And I told my story about trying to get a POTS line at the house here. It's just getting phased out. Here's a graph. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but here's a graph from Metrigy, on all kinds of engagement around POTS lines and what they expect to see. And it's obvious that this is phasing out. And it's not just analog voice, but also alarm systems. You still have regulations around elevator phones and all this other stuff. So the transition is key here. So before we dig into some diagrams and it's kind of a deep dive, a little bit more technical, anything else you want to add, Greg, before I jump into my transition diagrams?
No, again, I think that the thing here is to highlight, like, in a lot of respects, this is long overdue, right? Mm-hmm. And people shouldn't be particularly surprised that it's occurring. The challenge, however, is doing it in an orderly fashion.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's talk about the legacy infrastructure, just to baseline here real quick. And because to give you a preview, a sneak peek, right? I want to talk about this, and then we're going to talk about those phases of how NextGen is being implemented, and hopefully this gives you a flavor of how complex this could be. But right, we look at an old legacy, in architecture, especially from a voice over IP or VoIP perspective, right? You've got originating service providers that route calls natively, typically via voice over IP. Before we get into what they're routing to us, we have this basic concept here of where a lot of OSPs, some are still using PRIs and other legacy antiquated technology, but in the end, a lot of times what we see is they route the calls to us via voice over IP into the bandwidth network, and then we're operating. I would almost argue we were operating it prematurely, but since we're leveraging next-gen technologies, we're operating a LIS, a location information service or server, and then we have a 911 access network where we're routing those calls out through that access network to all the appropriate PSAPs across the country. And we're doing this with a standardized I2 technique, right? We're inserting ESQKs or PNEs, emergency services query keys, or PNEs into the call so that we can use that to identify the proper alley record that needs to be pulled up by the PSAP to properly get the location and all that information. So this is what the architecture looks like from a legacy E911 perspective. When we look at a phase one perspective, we add in this next gen network here, and the next gen network is now circled or highlighted in red, is really all about how do we move from legacy analog transmission into IP transmission. And then finally, we get into a full next-gen phase two situation here where we have the call information, the location information is embedded in the call going out to the next-gen network and the PSAP. So, and we start to see new acronyms in here like LVF, location validation function, that works with different LISs and so forth. And so over the last 10, 15 years, we've been evolving as an industry, going, all right, who's going to own the list? Who's going to own these different next gen networks? Sometimes it's going to be the legacy, the legacy exchange carrier, like Greg was saying. Sometimes it's not. This is how complicated the situation gets. But changing everything out here on the right side to IP is what it's all about. Yeah. Any thoughts there, Greg, before we move on?
No. I think the just calling out, what we're talking about with phase one versus phase two and what that means. Phase one, really, you can kind of summarize it as IP connectivity. Moving off of selector routers and plugging into an ESI net in IP. And then you talk about what goes along in phase two is really the I3 standards being embraced across the board to support full feature functionality of what the call content essentially consists of once that's done. But that goes beyond just that network connectivity, and it's really about the content and the substance of the content.
Yeah, and so as part of the final topic we wanted to cover here in this webinar today was all about preparing for next gen 911, and we've talked about a lot of different aspects of it, so we don't need to read through everything here, but kind of the three words that jump off this slide to me are coordination. Really, coordination's a big one. Obviously, coordinating on multiple different levels. Requirements, understanding requirements, and adapting really here, evolving, adapting, whatever word you want to use there. But those are the three words that jump off to me. You've got to evolve. That's what I've experienced over the last 10 to 15 years is there's been a lot of evolution, and it will continue as we better define and people better adopt and define their interpretation of I3, but also it takes coordination. I mean, like you said, Greg, it takes a village to make all this work.
Yeah, and I think those points really is preparing people for change, right? Change means that you can't take it all for granted in the same way that it's always been. We have to be prepared for new solutions, new approaches, and that's that transition. Adopting new approaches isn't going to happen overnight, right? And it's not going to happen without a lot of education, right, of all the providers that are involved, as well as the users. And so it is a different environment that will have different use implications, ultimately for the better. But we're in the moment of change right now, and that's not necessarily just going to happen instantaneously.
And I agree. And there's a lot of change that's got to happen. Change at the level of bandwidth interfacing with our customers, as well as interfacing with these next gen networks. There's a lot of change happening there. There's changes in the PSAPs. One of the things I've maintained over the last couple of years is that the way dispatchers or telecommunicators work, right? Historically, they've been measured based on how quickly do they answer a call and how quickly do they get off a call. They're just trying to process through these calls and get it dispatched. Well, with NextGen, with all this additional data and everything, either the dispatchers are going to have to become more of a quarterback, or the first responders are going to have to get exposed to all this data, which is also appropriate, or a combination thereof, right? It's going to take a lot of change across the whole spectrum of emergency services to make this successful. Because even if we, are able to send IP calls into these PSAPs, one of the things we've talked about on this is they've got to be ready to take it. And so, as the originating service providers and the new definition of covered 911 service providers changes, and we do what we're supposed to do per the FCC, right? There's other things that are going to change, and that takes, like we've been talking about, it takes coordination. I feel like we're almost beating a dead horse at this point, but it takes a lot of coordination. All right. Any other thoughts before we move on to questions, Greg? I think we've gotten through the material.
Yeah, I mean, we had one more slide after this. I think that covered a lot of those things you just touched on, Robin. And I would just say that, bandwidth sits in a unique position where it wears a lot of hats and sees a lot of these issues from a lot of different angles. We are a CLEC. We are a wholesale VoIP platform. We are a programmable voice platform. We are a sort of a wholesale emergency services aggregator. We support messaging services. We operate as a retail interconnected VoIP provider with MLTS obligations. So I just, I highlight a lot of those things because together with our customers and their use cases, we can bring a lot to the table to speak to these issues, some of the challenges that are occurring, and solve, the sort of issues that need to be solved together. We do encourage, as the FCC continues to contemplate more regulation at this time, for our customers to get engaged and certainly to partner with us to try to align our positions as that all occurs.
Yeah, I guess there's really two things I want people to walk away with this from. One was what we talked about a little bit earlier, that the FCC, the winds of change are blowing in emergency services regulations, and so be aware of that definition of a 911, covered provider. Make sure you're aware of that. But also, you heard Greg. We're inviting you. Come partner with us, please come partner with us. And let's talk about how we can collaborate and work towards bettering these regulations and so forth. Happy to that can take in a lot of different things, and we don't have to go into those details right now. But yeah, we're looking for some partners here. All right.
Yep. Now we're happy to take any questions if people have them.
Love it. Greg, Robin, thanks for your time, your expertise, the candid conversation. I know that's what customers and prospects alike, anyone who is interested in this topic, they want to hear the raw truth. So appreciate that. Like we have alluded to, we've gotten a couple of questions. If you haven't had the chance to go ahead and put your question in, reminder that you can leave any questions in our Q&A box to the right of the screen. We've got about 10 minutes that we'll work through a few questions with. First one that I see is, how will the transition to NextGen 911 improve our ability to communicate with emergency services, especially in terms of incorporating other IP-based communications like data, like video, text? And maybe as you guys are answering this, maybe provide a few examples. So I know that throughout the conversation, Robin, you mentioned the Hurricane Helene instance in North Carolina. I'm sure there are other instances or examples to share to bring it to life.
Yeah, I'll jump in, and then Greg, feel free to add plenty of color. One thing, having been experienced in this industry for longer than I care to admit, there are some interesting scenarios where you have 911 networks regulated on state borders, right? And so you've got a scenario where you've got a PSAP accepting calls across the, let's say the state border is a river, and they're on one side of the river, and then you got a PSAP on the other side of the river, right? And sometimes in those scenarios, historically, it's been impossible to do what's called a 911 transfer from one PSAP to the other, right? They have to do a normal just POTS line transfer over to that PSAP, and then when that happens, they lose all the location data, all the good stuff that goes along with that call, with that 911 call. So I think that's one aspect of this, like, similar to the Hurricane Helene example, is you've got these scenarios where, as we have the adoption of next gen 911 and networks, and we have a common playbook where calls can be transferred from one ESI net to the next ESI net, sometimes from just one PSAP across the river to the next PSAP. That is one of the problems that this is going to help solve. And that's not insignificant. I mean, I can't stress how significant this is. So you've got that. And then, of course, the other thing is everything we talk about in terms of next gen 911 is all the different modalities of communication, pictures, video, all that stuff. And I think it's going to emerge in ways that we don't think about. I think a lot of times we think about, well, pictures and video coming from a caller calling into 911. Well, it's also pictures and videos coming from first responders and drones and all this other stuff that's going to help, again, save lives and protect property.
One thing that I would highlight, I think, that is always critical in emergency calling is location information and accurate location information. And we're living in a much more mobile world, than ever. And so, Bandwidth has been a pioneer in trying to enable and advance dynamic location routing capabilities that gather location information in real time and can deliver that information. But there are then capabilities on the other end for receiving that information and being able to process that information in a way that makes sense so that people can respond to the emergency, right? And as rapidly as possible. This is something that, as we Bandwidth, again, I talk about wearing many hats. We're a global provider, and we're encountering some of these issues and sort of instances that aren't as advanced as we are here in the United States in the rest of the world, where location information is still very static. It's viewed as being very static. Yet the marketplace, as we know, is highly mobile, highly technical. And one of the things, Robin, I didn't hear you touch on that you can see happening very quickly is the introduction and use of AI, right? And so people need to be contemplating how that affects what information is being collected and how it's being transmitted and how it's being received, right? To enable successful emergency calling to its fullest extent.
Good point. Exactly.
Love it. Thanks, guys. So, interesting question. We talked a lot about change, and more from the position of Bandwidth, the service providers, our customers. How do you guys anticipate the public education about next-gen 911 capabilities and what's actually possible for those dialing emergency services? How do we anticipate that sort of change management to happen?
Oh, that's a great question. I was to say it's one word, but it's more than one word. Two words come to mind: social networking, right? I think I think I can safely speak for my kids in saying that they do a lot of learning on social networking and on screens. And so I think that's what we're seeing. At least what I'm seeing is a lot of PSAPs, a lot of public safety agencies, they're trying to leverage social networking. And then, I mean, obviously the other one's AI that Greg mentioned, but as there's got to be ways to, like you're saying, educate the community on what's possible and what they should be doing. I mean, we've done a great job as an industry of educating people about 911. It's a very, very well-known brand. It is an incredibly well-known brand, to the point that when SMS text to 911 was first released, a lot of the younger generation was like, why would I text to 911? I should just call. It's been, so there's some stuff there, but that's evolving as well. So I don't know. Those are my thoughts. Are it's going to take some, you got to go where the people are to educate them. And I think things like social networking and AR are going to be key here.
Again, I might just highlight that the education effort really is across the board. The sharing of information of where we are with 911 calling, in the marketplace at this moment in time. And it's not going to be a consistent message necessarily from one location to the next. Some places are much further along and more advanced than others. But, making sure that there is sufficient amounts of education of the people that, the public who need to be able to rely upon the ability to make a 911 call in an emergency, together with all of those that come into play for delivering those calls and responding to those calls successfully.
Yeah, what Greg, you're saying, not everybody's going to use the same playbook to educate. Anyway, yeah, there's a lot of PSAPs out there, a lot of different ways to do things. Exactly.
Sure. Yep. Matt just asked a question about documentation. So what kind of documentation do providers need to be keeping to make sure they're compliant with these regulations, with this new NextGen 911 protocol? And are there process requirements that folks should be thinking through?
Absolutely, there are. I will say, I'll jump in. I think one of the things that we want to kind of help customers with in the role that we play for them, really, I'd describe it as an aggregation role. Provisioning endpoints, with our emergency call routing capabilities, we're providing connectivity into the 911 network to deliver calls. Notices are going out. When we talk about public education, notices when ESI nets declare themselves to be ready, that everyone now needs to connect to them in IP. I don't think anyone really intends that to be everyone, literally everyone. There are aggregators who can continue to provide that connectivity and call delivery function, and that's what we're doing. So, to the extent that people are receiving those notifications, working with us to understand that, hey, we're the ones that are looking to be sure that the transition is successful. We can connect, and that takes care of you and your ability to deliver your calls successfully. So that's one example, I think, of a kind of the documentation. Really is that you've got a contract, you've got services in place, as you've had historically, as the migration occurs, to ensure that your 911 calling is taken care of.
Yeah, I'll just add one quick thing there, or a couple quick things, which is that a lot of you who have met me and listened to me before, you've heard me say the phrase, "I'm not a lawyer." Two things. Greg makes me say that, but also I'm not a lawyer. I shouldn't be giving legal advice. But I often, especially recently in talking about the PSAP outage alerts, I'm often telling our customers, go talk to your regulatory counsel, get those decisions, get them written down so that you have those. And as you go through this, consult your own legal counsel and get those policies written down and have those. I think that's a good thing. You agree, Greg? What else? Any other thoughts on that?
Well, I think that is it highlights one of the issues with PSAP outage notifications is that I think people didn't sort of fully appreciate that if you put everyone under an obligation to make an immediate report, you're going to get a lot of them. And is that really an outcome that the PSAPs is that valuable? Is that of value, or is it actually detrimental? And I think what we're seeing more and more people speak out about is they're finding that over notification is detrimental, because there is this legitimate question about what's the ultimate objective. What are people going to do with those outage notifications? And if they're all the same, if everyone is experiencing the same event, having 10,000 of them doesn't enhance, the outcome dramatically, right? So I think it's a good example of working through some of these things, like in real time. We're experiencing those and we're asking these questions, like what is the actual objective and how do we accomplish it most effectively?
Yeah.
Yep. Again, partner with us, please.
Yeah. I think that's a great note to end on. We're right at time. Greg and Robin, appreciate again the expertise and the conversation. For those joining and interested, again, the offer has been made a number of times. Partner with us, continue to have a conversation with us. We would love to talk more. Also, we're aware that we didn't get to all the questions. We're going to be taking those offline and making sure that we follow up accordingly with you all. And we're looking forward to having further conversations. Greg, Robin, again, appreciate the expertise. And thanks everyone for joining today.